Welcome to Journey Through Time, a channel that keeps important historical events for each day of the year. On February 19, 1985, a special BBC News report shocked the world. Images of emaciated children, exhausted people and barren fields of Ethiopia were shown on small screens in the West for the first time. This reportage not only changed the world's perception of famine but also marked one of the most important moments in international humanitarian history. What led to this disaster? What lessons can be learned from this tragedy? Let's go back in time to the early 1980s to better understand one of the worst humanitarian crises in modern history. The famine that took place from 1983 to 1985 mainly occurred in the Horn of Africa, with the focus on Ethiopia, Sudan, and some neighboring countries. This is not the first time this region has faced a food crisis. But the scale and severity of this disaster has far exceeded all predictions. About 1 million people died due to famine as a direct result of this disaster, while about 8 million people were severely affected by malnutrition and disease. One of the direct causes of famine is the El Niño phenomenon, which causes severe droughts in East Africa. Meteorological data show that average rainfall in Ethiopia has decreased by 40 to 60% compared to normal levels in 1982 to 1984. This makes 85% of Ethiopia's agricultural land dry and unable to produce food. In northern regions such as Tigray and Wollo, crop failures reached 90%, while in other areas, 50% of livestock died due to lack of water and grass. Prolonged drought not only causes crop failures but also creates conditions for diseases to spread, weakening the immune systems of already malnourished people. Besides natural factors, the famine was also exacerbated by the long-running civil war between Mengistu Haile Mariam's government and rebel forces such as the Tigray People's Liberation Front and the Eritrean Liberation Front. Fighting not only devastated infrastructure but also cut off food supply routes to the most severely affected areas. The Ethiopian government has prioritized funding the military over humanitarian assistance, with more than 46% of the 1984 national budget devoted to military rather than food relief. Not stopping there, Mengistu also carried out a forced population transfer campaign, forcing about 600,000 to 1 million people from the northern regions to relocate to lands unprepared to receive population. This leads to a serious shortage of food and clean water in the receiving areas, exacerbating the famine situation. Additionally, Mengistu's government blocked food aid from reaching rebel-controlled areas, leading to dire consequences. While international organizations worked to distribute food, many aid convoys were stopped or confiscated by government troops and armed opposition groups. The Mengistu government's centralized economic policies not only caused production stagnation but also collapsed the food distribution system. Mandatory agricultural cooperatives forced farmers to surrender a large portion of their output to the government, leaving many without enough food to feed their families. In 1984, Ethiopia's national food production fell 21% from its annual average. Meanwhile, the government continues to export food to earn foreign currency. Despite widespread hunger, this led to popular uprisings in many areas, but the protests were brutally suppressed. In addition, the Ethiopian government also introduced high agricultural taxes to control income from agriculture, causing many farmers to abandon their land because they were no longer able to produce. Transportation systems and food storage are tightly controlled, making it impossible for millions of people to access aid, even though famine had been going on for the previous 2 years. The world seemed indifferent, but then, on February 19, 1985, the BBC broadcast a special report by journalist Michael Burke in Ethiopia. He described the scene before him in unforgettable words. "This is hell on earth." The report was broadcast on BBC News, ITN in the UK, and quickly spread on major television stations such as CBS and ABC in the US. Images of malnourished children lying on the ground, helpless mothers watching their children die of starvation, and long lines of people waiting for meager pieces of bread have shaken audiences around the world. The public's reaction did not stop at sympathy. Humanitarian organizations immediately convened emergency meetings. Mr. Bob Geldof, an Irish artist, after watching the news said, "I can't believe what I'm seeing. We can't stand by and do nothing." In a press conference immediately after the report was broadcast, representative of the International Red Cross, Mr. Peter McPherson, said, "We have been warning about this situation for a long time. But it seems the world only really paid attention when it saw these heartbreaking images on the small screen. Now, there is no time to argue. We must act immediately." Millions of people around the world started taking action. International charities such as Oxfam, UNICEF, and the International Red Cross quickly launched emergency relief campaigns. Some prominent campaigns include: UNICEF has launched programs to distribute food, clean water and medicine to the most affected areas. The International Red Cross set up dozens of nutrition centers to treat people with severe malnutrition. The United States Agency for International Development and the United Nations cooperated to transport more than 500,000 tons of food relief into Ethiopia in 1985 alone. The Live Aid event, held on July 13, 1985, bringing together the most famous artists of the time such as Queen, David Bowie and U2, raised more than $125 million, helping millions of people with food and water. The international press continuously reported on the disaster, creating a wave of outrage in global public opinion and putting strong pressure on the Ethiopian government. Humanitarian organizations and Western governments demanded that Mengistu's government open its doors to international aid. However, Ethiopian authorities fear that allowing foreign aid will weaken their power and empower rebel groups. Faced with growing international pressure, the US, UK and the United Nations began using strong diplomacy, threatening to cut other aid if Ethiopia did not accept humanitarian relief. US President Ronald Reagan and British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher have made public statements criticizing the Mengistu government, asking them to cooperate with the international community. However, despite diplomatic pressure, Mengistu still tightly controlled food distribution. The government prioritized food distribution to regions loyal to the regime, while many rebel-controlled areas did not receive any help. Corruption and politicization of relief causes many food sources to be blocked or used for military purposes. By the end of 1985, although international aid had finally reached some of the hardest-hit areas, hundreds of thousands of people had died as a result of these delays. The famine of 1983 to 1985 became a tragic example of how politics can hinder humanitarian relief efforts. The 1983 to 1985 famine was a dire warning about the impact of politics, climate change and the media on humanity. International reports and statements from humanitarian organizations have drawn many profound lessons from this tragedy. On the politicization of humanitarian relief, according to a 1986 United Nations report, the Ethiopian government's control of aid to serve political interests not only exacerbated the disaster but is also a classic example of how politics can hinder humanitarian efforts. Mr. Kofi Annan, former Secretary General of the United Nations, once said, "There is nothing more cruel than using food as a political weapon in times of crisis." The Ethiopian case has become a lesson in later crises. From the 1998 famine in Sudan to the current humanitarian crisis in Yemen. For the power of communication, a 1991 United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization report emphasized that without the BBC's reporting, millions of people would have been forgotten. The media plays an important role in putting pressure on governments to take action. Mr. Bob Geldof, founder of the Live Aid event, once said, "We cannot change the world if we do not know the truth about it." And the press has shown us the truth. Climate change and food crisis. A 2010 World Bank study found that climate change could increase the risk of food crises such as the 1983 to 1985 famine. Data from the World Agricultural Organization also showed that drought patterns in East Africa were repeated several times in the following decades. causing international organizations to consider long-term strategies to deal with the problem. Nearly 40 years have passed since the 1983 to 1985 famine. This disaster raises the question: has the world really learned anything from this tragedy? Despite progress in humanitarian aid, political conflicts and climate change continue to cause food crises globally. David Beasley, executive director of the World Food Programme, warned in a 2020 speech, "We have enough food to feed the world, but politics and war are still pushing millions of people into hunger." Without timely preparation and action, will history repeat itself?